Hello, Professor Kent Lee here. Welcome back to my academic writing class, Advanced Writing or Advanced Composition. And in this video, I'm going to talk more about a literature review. If you've read academic papers, you have seen either a literature review section or basically aspects of a literature review in papers you've read. In science papers, social science papers, language research, a lot of linguistics research papers, you'll see an actual formal literature review section. In other kinds of papers, like in other humanities fields, there are elements of a literature review before the writer gets onto his or her main analysis or presenting his or her main points. There is often some kind of a background section of sections that include discussion of previous research, previous literature, previous scholarly work on the very same topic. A literature review is an overview of previous research, previous scholarly work on the very same topic, the topic that the writer, like you, are writing about in your research paper. It's an overview, an evaluation of relevant academic research or scholarly work that has been published on a specific research topic, like the one that you're doing for your paper. And it's also the beginning of a larger research paper or project. You have a literature review, introduction literature review, and that's often maybe the beginning of what's going to be a larger research paper, a final research paper or project on that topic. So the purpose of a literature review is not just to summarize past studies by other scholars or researchers, but also an evaluation or maybe even a critique. It's about kind of putting it all together and what does all this research mean? When we look at all this research, and again, if you're a college student, it may not be a whole lot, maybe just a handful of studies that you can handle, but with sufficient discussion of each study, each research article, in order to say, okay, what's the overall, what do we know about this topic? Or what are different views and ideas on this topic? Provides an overall view of the research on this topic and what it means at least for you and for the purposes of writing your paper, doing your research. And may also involve some critique, kind of critiquing them in terms of how good, how effective they are, and how much they contribute to our understanding of the topic. It can include elements of evaluating the sources in the research, some cases talking about their applications, evaluating them in terms of how useful they are for application. So for example, in education research, language education, maybe some of you are doing that. You're looking at maybe past research about studies on teaching methods and teaching techniques, or studies of a particular aspect of the English language. And then in your paper, evaluating them in terms of, okay, how would these apply, or how applicable are these, how useful are these for language teaching, for teaching maybe a certain concept or a certain language form in the classroom. It might be also a way of building up to a particular research question by examining the past research in the field in order to get to your particular research question. Okay, what question do you want to deal with in your paper ultimately? Maybe a research hypothesis if it's a more empirical or scientific kind of paper. Especially if you're a college student, the literature review is for developing your own arguments. You're looking at past research or scholarly work on a particular topic or question in order to develop your own argument. So for example, if you're writing a literature paper about, the interpretation of a particular novel, particular interpretation of a poem, you might look at different views on this in order to kind of develop and advance your own interpretation to show that your interpretation is a valid one and it's not too wild and crazy, and it maybe builds on or is comparable to what other scholars have talked about. It could be your own argument for how to teach something, again, especially if it's more of an application type paper. Based on past research on this. How do we teach this? How do we, what's a better way of teaching, English perfect tense to high school students in your country who are learning English as a second language? But your own argument for, okay, what are some better ways of teaching this? Whether it's teaching Shakespeare, teaching a grammar form, teaching English writing skills, college, high school level, or something like that. You're developing your own argument based on past research. Rather than developing your own research hypothesis and doing your own original research, especially if you're a college student, it may be this. You're using this as a way of developing your own argument in the main body of your paper. That will be the final paper. Research gap. If you're doing empirical research, especially original research, especially if you're a graduate student, it's to identify a gap in the research. As I mentioned before in some previous videos, you look at what other studies have done or said about this, and you critique them and say, okay, here's something they haven't looked at yet. What about this? That's your research question. That's a gap. Or it could be some studies have looked at this, but I don't like the way that they did it. I want to do it better. I want to do a better job. Let's do this. So you put forth a research question or a hypothesis based on that by identifying gaps or weaknesses in the past research. Again, this is more so if you're doing original research, especially if you're a graduate student. And finally, it can be used as the literature review can be the basis of a proposal for your own research. Again, if you're a person doing original research, empirical research, especially if you are a graduate student. If you're a college student, more so it's mainly for developing your own arguments, putting together your own arguments or questions or application type paper or something like that. So one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to look for sources. First step, find some sources. Literature review involves reviewing sources. If it's a college paper, you might not want to cite a whole book unless you've actually already read it and it's a relevant book on research on the topic. You're going to want to find research articles, published research articles. So where do you go? Start looking. Go to search engines and databases. So a search engine like Google Scholar for academic sources. Library databases, your university library probably has a database or uses some, subscribes to some. If you're just using the search engine on your library website, that'll give you access to the various databases your library subscribes to with information. There may be databases like PubMed, ScienceDirect, Ebesco, etc. Within Korea, again, RIS is a good search engine for scholarly research written in Korea. Again, it gives you a lot of stuff that you probably don't want to use. You might not want to use whole books, unless you actually are going to read that whole book for your research paper. It's going to give you PhD dissertations, master's theses, and I would suggest that you not use those unless you are a graduate student and you have a good idea of how to judge their quality and what's usable. Mainly stick with the Sononmun or the research articles that have been published. Also KCI, the KCI website limits your search to published research journals, journal articles published within Korea. That would be a good place to go. Now, let's say you find an article online. You can read the abstract and that's it, but you really want the article. It looks really good, but you can't access it. It's behind a paywall. They want you to pay money. That's kind of wrong. That's wrong because most of the research that's done and published by academic people is directly or indirectly funded by governments, institutions, universities, and then greedy academic publishers are taking the work, the research articles by academic people and basically saying, this is ours. Yeah, Professor so-and-so wrote this, but this is ours now. If you want it, you got to pay us money. That's wrong. That's ethically wrong. And so what I'm going to recommend you do, well, the first thing, if you're not in a big hurry, you can email the author. They're often really happy to share their research articles with people email the author. They'll be happy to, because they want their works to be read and cited and used. Otherwise, look for a website called Sci-Hub. This is a website that collects, thousands and thousands of published academic articles that would otherwise be behind paywalls, and you can access them. So look, their website has to move around because, while it's technically illegal, what they're doing is just ethically, I think, a very good service for the academic community. So look for Sci-Hub, Sci-Hub with a hyphen. There are other websites with Sci-Hub without the hyphen, and that's not what you want. It's Sci-Hub. Look for it. Again, their websites sometimes have to move because they kind of get in trouble for what they're doing, but don't be afraid to use Sci-Hub. I mean, honestly, it sounds technically illegal, but honestly, a lot of professors use Sci-Hub. A lot of PhD students use Sci-Hub. A lot of academic people use Sci-Hub for articles that are behind paywalls that shouldn't. As you're searching, here's some tips for searching. Of course, you can search for keywords. Here's keywords. You can use what are called Boolean operators, the words like or and, to combine search terms. And this is especially true for Google searches, Google Scholar. You can use quotation marks to combine words. If you want, like if you just type in second language, you might get all kinds of stuff with second or language. You want second language, put them in quotes. You can do L2 or second language to look for stuff about that's with the keyword L2 or second language together. Perfect tense, you're looking for instruction, teaching of the perfect tense. You can use and, like you can search for French and Spanish if you're interested in that. Both concepts together in your keyword searches in Google. Also, especially in Google, if you find a really good article, this is cool, this is great, in Google Scholar that is, you can then see an option there. You can click to find other articles that have cited this article, and those might be good sources too. Now, eventually you might end up with quite a few possible sources, so be selective. Especially if you're a college student, you can't review a lot of stuff. You're not writing a PhD dissertation. Focus on the sources that are most relevant to your topic, especially your particular arguments or ideas on this topic. Focus on the sources that are the best quality, that are informative, good quality. Also, focus on only those that you can actually understand. Do not try to cite and use stuff you cannot understand. If you can't understand it, just leave it. Forget it. Because you're going to look, well, kind of bad in a paper if you're talking about stuff that's clearly over your head, over your level, and the professor will be suspicious. Either the kind of source that you're using is way too advanced for, if you're a college student and you're using something that's obviously way too advanced for college students, and when you write about it, it's clear you don't understand what you're writing about. So don't do that. You'll make yourself look really bad. Try to find some research articles that offer different perspectives on the topic, maybe different views, differing arguments. For example, if it's about interpretation of a famous poem, find some articles that represent different perspectives on it. If it's more of an empirical research topic, find some research that represents different research methods or different theoretical approaches, or different views on the different perspectives on the very same question. The age of the articles might be something to consider. If you are in a STEM field, so that stands for science, technology, engineering, and math, especially science, technology, engineering. Research articles that are older than 5 years would be considered outdated. And so in a lot of science fields, it's rare to cite stuff that's more than 5 years old, unless it's just really somehow important to the field or just really famous research. For social sciences, like language education, language research, applied linguistics, psychology, sociology, most of the sources are going to be within 20 years. Not much that's older than 20 years, unless, again, it's just some really super famous, super great article. So about 20 years is kind of the time range for those fields. Theoretical linguistics can be older than that sometimes. Humanities fields like history, philosophy, literature studies can be much older. I mean, you could be citing some dead Greek guy from 2,000 years ago, and that's totally cool. Or a English translation of a famous French work from 200 years ago. In humanities, the age may not matter, the age of the research. That's fine. Next, so read and save the really good articles you have. Then look at the abstracts, the key sections, the introduction sections, their lit review sections, their discussion sections in those articles. Decide which ones you want to use. The better sources, the most relevant sources are things you're going to pay more attention to and write about more in your literature review. Other sources that are maybe not so bad, you probably give them less attention, less focus in your literature review, and sources that are just repetitive or not good quality or minor, you can maybe just discard, because you want to focus on the stuff that's actually relevant and useful to you. And you don't want an information dump. I mean, depending on the kind of topic you're doing, you might be reviewing 5 sources, maybe 10 sources. If it's a college paper, that might be enough. You're not trying to, provide an extensive history and research on the topic. What you want to do is instead focus on the most relevant and the best research articles that represent maybe some different perspectives on your topic. Next stage. For each of these good sources you've got, write some summaries of them. And not just a summary, but take some notes. What are the key ideas that the writer is talking about? What are the key arguments the writer is trying to get across? What are the main arguments? Maybe how did they do their research? What were their findings? You can oftentimes skip the research methods and mainly focus on the findings as you write your summaries. The research methods might not be important, except maybe a phrase like, oh, they did a survey study. That may be enough. What's important is to write about the findings. Okay, what did they do? What did they find? Or their argument. What are the main arguments? Their main contributions. Focus on what we learn from this. What does this contribute to your knowledge of the field? What are the implications of this? What are the meanings of this? If it's an applied linguistics, language education article, you don't need to go into any details about how they did the research. Just, they did a comparison study teaching 2 classrooms, different teaching methods, and they found this. Students taught this method, had much better scores and showed long-term improvement in this. Implications, what does this mean? Well, this might be a good idea to teach this language form using a technique like this. Implications. So focus on the contribution, the results, the implications, the contributions, and the implications. Literature research, again, you don't need to go into a lot of explaining the theoretical background behind each scholar and the reasoning and such. Just their main ideas in their research that are relevant to your paper if you're doing literature research. If you're doing literature analysis, novels, poems, and English literature, analyzing novels and poems and short stories and such. Next, start writing the paper, creating the paper. Organize it. So what's going to be the main literature review section? Organize it. You've got short summaries of the papers. Again, don't just summarize the studies, but also include your at least one sentence of evaluating and critiquing what are the strengths and or the weaknesses of each study. So don't just summarize. When you write summaries of each source, summarize it, but also, again, the key points, the contributions, findings, implications, and the strengths and or weaknesses. What are the strengths of this paper? What does it show us? Okay, next stage, create the paper, start writing the paper. All these sources you've got, you've got little summaries of them, kind of evaluative summaries of them. Organize them. What's a good way to organize them? It might be chronological in terms of somebody did this study, later somebody did this study. Could be chronological arrangement, or it could be a thematic, like here's a group of studies that are presenting this perspective on the issue, and then here's a group of studies that are presenting a different perspective. You can organize it by theme or by different perspectives, different kinds of arguments, different kinds of theories. More empirical research, it could be the research method. Okay, here's some studies that use this research method, and this is what they found. Then you go on, next paragraph, here's some studies that used a different research method, and this is what they found. If you have a lot of studies, you could be like by theme, and then within the theme, then it could be chronological. So some researchers were using this research method. First, this group of researchers did this, and then later another research study did this, and so on. And then next research method, well, here's a group of researchers that used a different research method, Okay, get the idea. So organize it in a way that makes sense for what you're doing in your paper. Don't just throw sources, don't just, throw your summaries in together randomly. Organize them in a way that makes sense so it flows nicely and logically. A logical organization. Start to combine these summaries. Avoid, again, as you put them together, avoid this kind of patchwork where it's just like, here's a summary. Organize them together, and as you do so, kind of show how they are. You contrast and compare them. Here are some studies using this kind of approach or this kind of perspective. As you're doing that, compare them to each other. So-and-so did this, but so-and-so did that. So-and-so did a better study that provides better support for this, something like this. So there should be some element of evaluating, analyzing, critiquing, contrasting, comparing, relating them to each other. The study that did this, and then several other studies built upon that and provided more evidence. How does one work build upon another? That might be one way to do your literature review, and to connect things together, contrast and compare them. Toward the end of the literature review, after you have summarized the major studies or works that you've looked at, bring it all together. Some sort of a synthesis or a summary paragraph or paragraphs where you now provide us an overview of these different studies and what they show us, what we learned from them, or the different perspectives. It can be summarized and synthesized, evaluate the different perspectives, the different research approaches, different viewpoints on this, maybe the different theories on this topic, arguments and counterarguments. This group of scholars thinks we should view this famous novel in this way, and here's a group of scholars who think we should interpret it that way. Then kind of contrast and compare overall, more of a global contrast, comparison, evaluation, synthesis from all these studies. This is kind of what we now understand about this topic, especially for empirical work. That leads in probably to finally getting to your own research question or objective to the paper. Based on this past research, okay, where do you want to go from here? What you're doing in a literature review is part of what's going to be a larger final research paper someday at some later point. So a literature review can then help you to identify your own objective or your own perspective on the topic, maybe your own arguments that you're going to develop later on in the final paper. And that's something you can do at the end of your literature review. You're based on the past studies you've looked at on this topic, identify your objective, your main argument, your perspective that you want to develop in the final paper, and why. Why do you want to do that? How are you going to do it? Briefly. Next, okay, you've got the main body of your literature review. After that, start the introduction to your paper. Identify for the reader. By now, you've done the reading of the literature on the topic. You've got a good idea now of the topic and what it is and what it looks like. So in your intro, your introduction, you can now write this, identify the topic or question that you're looking at. Maybe identify the core concepts and how these concepts or terms are defined. Again, you assume that your reader is intelligent, and you don't have to define everything if it would be pretty obvious to anybody in the field. But your topic, some of the concepts, might not be familiar to everyone. So assume that your reader is intelligent, but maybe not have the knowledge that you have now on this topic. So you might need to identify core terms and concepts, how they are defined or how they developed. It could be how a particular theory is defined or developed, how a particular concept related to this topic, the topic itself, how it's defined, how our understanding has developed. Identify the purpose of your paper. What are you going to do? Specific background information on your topic might help. If you're doing more of an empirical paper, original research, identify the research gap or question or hypothesis. Otherwise, I guess for most typical college students, maybe in your introduction you can provide, like in 1 or 2 sentences, a brief summary of the different perspectives that you're going to look at in the lit review. Maybe formulate here then your thesis, the main point of your paper, the main thesis, the main objective of your paper, or the main argument of your paper that's going to be supported by the lit review. And maybe it would help also to outline the main points that you might talk about later on. Or at least the main perspectives you're going to look at in the literature review. Before you turn in your paper, your literature review, I would suggest you take a good look at your source citations and the sources and how you've used them and cited them. First, of course, you should cite the sources that you have used in your literature review using a proper source citation system. If you don't know the details, okay, just imitate the style of citing sources that you have seen in the papers you've read. Maybe the papers you've read, looked at for your lit review, they go da-da-da, then parentheses, author, year, or author, comma, year. Or just author, page number. If it's in literature studies, literature research, it's maybe often author, page number, or just author, if there are no page numbers. Then you need an end references section. So you need in-text citations in the body of your paper. And then at the end of your paper, references or works cited, where you list all the sources you cited. Every source cited in your paper should be listed in the end references or works cited. And only the sources cited in your paper should be listed in the end references or works cited. And again, if you are not familiar with the style of doing end references, just follow the style used in the articles that you read. Discuss multiple sources intelligently in a way that shows that you've actually read them, at least enough of the papers that you've understood them. You've understood the main ideas, you've grasped the main ideas, and you know what you're talking about. Cite multiple sources, provide enough context or explanation of important ideas and concepts that these papers deal with. Again, make sure that you explain the different findings and implications of these papers or the different perspectives, and with clear logical flow from one to another. We talk about maybe in the 1 or 2 sentences, maybe 3 or more sentences if it's a really important source. Kind of summarize the ideas or contents of this source. Then you move on to the next one and use transitional expressions or whatever, like further support for that comes from another study by so-and-so. Or this study has some shortcomings, so another group of researchers did this to provide further support or to look at that better. Different transitional expressions, contrast, like so-and-so claimed this, however so-and-so argues differently, or offer your own kind of support or counters. talk about this research study, and this is what they report, what they claim they found, and what they claim are the findings and implications. You might be skeptical yourself, and so go ahead and say that. However, a shortcoming of this study is, don't use a phrase like although or however. Say, however, a shortcoming or problem with this study is that they didn't look at that. They didn't consider this. So make sure you have good transitions between the different sections within the paragraph and from one paragraph to another as you're flowing from one perspective to another, one study to another. Good use of sources, good referencing, citations of sources, transitions. Make sure that it flows well, that the reader knows what you're talking about as you go from one point to another, and then go on to your own ideas at the end when you then provide your own kind of summary or overview of the research at the end of your literature review. So those are some suggestions for a literature review. And in the next video, I'm going to talk more about proposals, which are really like a literature review, but go on further to develop a more specific explanation of what the rest of the paper or research project is then going to do based on that. So that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed doing a literature review. It's a really important academic exercise, really good one, a good way of getting familiar with the topic. So good luck with that, have fun, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.